The epistle lesson for the text from the lectionary for this morning from 2 Corinthians in the 6th chapter. As we work together with him, we urge you also not to accept the grace of God in vain. For he says, at an acceptable time I have listened to you, and on a day of salvation I have helped you. See, now is the acceptable time. See, now is the day of salvation. We are putting no obstacle in anyone's way, so that no fault may be found with our ministry. But as servants of God, we have commended ourselves in every way, through great endurance, in afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, riots, labors, sleepless nights, hunger, by purity, knowledge, patience, kindness, holiness of spirit, genuine love, truthful speech, and the power of God, with the weapons of righteousness for the right hand and for the left, in honor and dishonor, in ill repute and good repute. We are treated as impostors and yet are true, as unknown and yet are well known, as dying and then see we are alive, as punished and not killed, as sorrowful yet always rejoicing, as poor yet making many rich, as having nothing and yet possessing everything. We have spoken frankly to you, Corinthians. Our heart is wide open to you. There are no restrictions in our affections, but only in yours. In return, I speak as to children. Open wide your hearts also. This is the wisdom of the Lord.
On you, Jim.
We all have our roles in life, our callings, our vocations. Part of growing up is discovering what that will be, and hopefully it would be at least an appendage to the job we have that is giving us a life. I never felt called to anything entrepreneurial, and I knew very early on in my life that money and destiny were not mine. On the other hand, I fell into parenting quite easily, and I chose it because of its great salary and its benefits. Ha ha. Aaron periodically recently has been teased by his coworkers, his former coworkers at Cocoon House, about the fact that his parents growing up loved him. This notwithstanding the youth who are there, even the workers often came from homes where they did not feel loved. And part of that is what guided them to what they do. He was also jeered because something like, "You mean you talk about that with your dad?" I don't know what they were talking about, but I can imagine it. Kenneth left in his wake, both at Jackson High School and American University, an appreciation for open hearts and minds. He was a bit of an evangelist at American for United Methodism, the progressive version. One of his friends, upon his passing, even got a tattoo of an open heart. Last month, I received a letter from a friend of Kenneth at Jackson. Someone that I did not know, and she even said she wasn't that close to Kenneth, but she was close enough to write this. He was one of the least judgmental people I have ever met. It was evident that Kenneth held the church's motto, open hearts, open minds, open doors, very close. He had an innate ability to lift others up to their best selves, regardless of who it was or what they were doing. He led with confidence and compassion over everything else. Your son has inspired me and many as well, and he will continue to do so for much time to come. His legacy will lead just as gracefully as he did in life. open hearts, minds, and doors. And open communion is a disposition we are called to carry as we engage in life. Open doors seems fairly easily to understand. We strive to be a church that welcomes all people, regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, social status, disability, sexual orientation, age, political affiliation, and anything else that divides us. Open minds also seems relatively clear. We are open to differences and perspectives. We are not a doctrinal church. We live the questions. We believe in dialogue and in sharing. But what does open heart really mean? Regarding the text from 2 Corinthians, I could not but consider open hearts today. I'm reading now from the Message. Dear Corinthians, I can tell you how much I long for you to enter into this wide open, spacious life. We didn't fence you in. The smallness you feel comes from within you. Your lives aren't small, but you're living them in a small way. I'm speaking as plainly as I can with great affection. Open up your lives. Live openly and expansively. Once again, Paul is frustrated with the Corinthians because he believes the leadership there is manipulative, selfish, and being too political. In other words, they're living the way of the world, what Paul called sarx, or flesh, which we talked about recently. And a part of living in the world is calculating, being cautious, acquiring as many things as you can, and being centered on yourself. Rather than living like this, Paul promotes wide open hearts, wide open, spacious living. The Greek word cardia, of course, for heart, is the seat of the soul. So this means something of some depth. It isn't just that we are to be hospitable and nice. Open hearts does not just mean being hospitable and nice. In early Methodism, when people gathered in small groups, they asked the question, how is your heart today? Or how is it with your soul? These were very deep questions, not like, how are you today? Or what do you got going on today? In these small groups, they shared the depth of themselves, their joys, their concerns, their struggles, their sufferings. They shared the stories of their lives with vulnerability and without pretense or calculation. You could say that they bared their souls. When we hear in the Bible the words, their hearts were hardened, I imagine closed hearts, crowded hearts, full of conflicting feelings, full of cunning and computation and guile. I think that if we pay attention, we can intuit a person who has a closed heart. I think you can see it in their eyes, about estimation and evaluation constantly going on in their brains. I think one can intuit a person who has an open heart as well. There is an absence of restraint. There's an absence of self-focus. And one can feel that they are actually entering into our world, listening to us, creating in themselves a space that we can enter safely. Instead of our hearts full of blocks like greed and selfishness and bias and fear, an open-hearted person becomes a vessel for God's grace and love. And I think you can feel it when you're in the presence of such a person. In Buddhism, they say that one must give up the false self. That is the same kind of self I think Paul is talking about. That's cunning, calculating, self-involved. To let go of all the junk that crowds our heads. And in Buddhism, they say this leads to junsui, purity, or genuineness, where there is no distinction between what's in one's heart and how one lives. That's June Sweet. It should remind us of one of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the pure in heart. Anybody know the end of that one? For they shall see God. I think the hardest thing and one of the biggest reasons people have trouble opening their hearts is because it's difficult not to be accepted or hurt. And it's true, if one bears one's soul, one opens oneself to be a target of ridicule. But the message is whatever comes from an open heart, be it suffering or sacrifice or whatever it is, those consequences are better than living with a closed heart. The open heart must find its identity not on the outside, but in one's interior. That comes not from the world of accomplishment, but from God's grace, first and above all things. An open heart says, here I am without one plea. Tease me if you want to. Here I am with all that I lack, with my disabilities and my failures. Yet does God still work in me and love me? Here I am without one plea, gifts and disabilities by the grace of God. Yes, I have PTSD. Yes, I have ADHD. Yes, I'm an addict. Yes, I have problems with my weight. Yes, I love romance novels, so get over it. Yes, I went through a painful divorce. Yes, I still suck my thumb. Anybody ever see that movie, The Thumbsucker? Anybody out there see The Thumbsucker? It's about Justin, who is a senior in high school and still sucking his thumb. And his father was going nuts. He finally finds an unconventional orthodontist played by Keanu Reeves. This orthodontist hypnotizes him and tells him, your thumb does not taste like echinacea. I'm sorry, I laugh at that one. And he stops sucking his thumb, but then he's diagnosed with ADHD. Then they give him drugs, but he abuses the drugs. He becomes a mean person. And then he meets this orthodontist again on the street, and the orthodontist says, hey, I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry about what I did. There's nothing wrong with sucking your thumb. In the final scene, he is fast asleep on a bus, I think, with his thumb in his mouth, and there's a beautiful girl sitting next to him, and he wakes up, pulls his thumb out and smiles, and she smiles back, and well, I'll just leave it there. An open-hearted person's identity is rooted in God's love, which incites accepting ourselves with all that is lacking and allowing God to work through our unpolished vessels, even if we suck our thumbs, have ADHD, or anything else. And you know that parents have a lot to do with all of this, particularly fathers. Conventionally, we men have a harder time opening our hearts. We are taught to play it safe. We are taught to play it safe. If you reveal yourself, you will be ridiculed and you will be left out. And I feel in some ways, not in all ways, it's getting more difficult for boys. I know it's difficult for girls and women, but on one count, it's very difficult for boys. You might remember that I said that our culture is a yang culture. And those kinds of, the kinds of values that are advanced in a yang culture are associated with men usually: competition, growth, analysis, activity, assertion, strength. And the bias is that because we focus on those attributes, even women can entertain them, and they can be aggressive and ambitious and tough. Have you ever seen women playing soccer recently? I remember when there was a game between practice game between Kenneth's team and the high school group of girls, and those guys went nuts because the women were elbowing them all over the place, and they still had in their heads, I can't do that. I can't do that. They lost the game. Conversely, if a boy demonstrates anything you could call yenny, that's yen, anything like that, you know what they're called? Gay. Still. I recall a youth retreat where I found 3 girls in one single bed, giggling, wrestling with each other, having a great time. And my first thought was, oh my God, boys could never do that. Boys are still being taught and brought up to be self-contained and in control, which means to have a closed heart. And these boys grow up, and a lot of them become depressed, and others of them become violent, and one of them became the leader of the free world. What boys need from fathers is their open hearts, emotional availability, the ability to put ourselves aside and take in the life of our children without judgment, and the space for them, first, to feel the grace of God and to be assured of God's love in their life. And parents have a great deal of control over that. This means letting our children see who we are by the grace of God. Our children need to know our stories, how we have struggled, how we have suffered. In the case of fathers, how we have dealt with what it means to be a boy and a man in American culture. They need to know how we have managed this territory. They need our presence. Not quality time, they need our presence. They don't need curt answers, specific instructions, glib advice. They need our wide open hearts. For the past 10 weeks, I participated in a group that's sponsored by Virginia Mason Hospital for traumatic death. A couple of weeks ago, the leader presented to us what she called 2 kinds of grief. There's instrumental grief and there's intuitive grief. Instrumental grief is private. Tears are rare. Emotions are coalesced into cognitive statements. Grief is managed. Grievers are pragmatic, and they look for ways to fix their grief. They're action-oriented, they're future-focused. Intuitive grievers, on the other hand, experience intense feelings. Tears flow. These grievers process their story with others. They describe their grief with great emotion, and their outward grieving mirrors their inner experience. When I heard about instrumental and intuitive grief, I was just like a man, very direct, not thinking, and I said, I know about that. Instrumental grieving is what I should be doing as a man in American culture, while intuitive grieving is what I feel in my heart. Intuitive grievers are open-hearted. In general, in our culture, we grieve instrumentally. We hold the cards close to our chest, restrained and careful, resisting our feelings rather than embracing them with closed hearts. I think we grieve instrumentally because, by and large, we live instrumentally. And we parent instrumentally. This is what we have learned. The instrumentally minded parent pays attention to how a child is seen in the world. Don't be an idiot out there. How they're seen in the world, what they accomplish, measurable goals and status. The parents who had their children get into USC by cheating were instrumental parents. The intuitively minded parent starts with who our children are. Not who we want them to be, but who they are. We intuit their dispositions rather than hoist expectations on them, and root their experience not on the outside, but in the depths of God's grace. We hope to raise people with junsui, pure hearts. And I'll tell you, it's a rare thing. You know, it really would be hard to have a son who's a senior in high school who's still sucking his thumb. I can tell you, if that was my child, my first response, of course, was, how embarrassing. He's going to get bullied and teased. It's going to be terrible. You got to change this. Do something. And then the intuitive response is the first to see the thumb sucking in the context of God's love for him, how God sees him, and see the thumb sucking as part of his coping with life, not as a fault. The intuitive parent would then be able to say, as the orthodontist did, there's nothing wrong with sucking your thumb. It's better than many other coping mechanisms. What children need is our wide open hearts, starting with grace, not judgment or embarrassment. What the world needs from us as well is our open hearts. Much more than being nice and hospitable. It's about our identity being rooted in God, where there is no disparity between what is in our hearts and how we live, allowing us to become vessels of God's Spirit. Isn't that what we want for our children? And isn't that what we really want for our own lives? Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Amen.